Welcome to the virtual Pathfinder channel. This is a review of the Panasonic Lumix 14mm F2.5 lens for Micro Four Thirds cameras. We will take a closer look at all important aspects of this lens. If you're interested in photography, lenses and camera equipment, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. I'm interested to hear your opinion about this lens. Please write what you think about it in the comment section below. Panasonic is one of the founders of the Micro Four Thirds standard along with Olympus. The Micro Four Thirds standard was developed by Panasonic and Olympus in 2008. This is a native Micro Four Thirds lens. The focal length is 14mm, which is equivalent to 28mm focal length for full-frame cameras. That makes it a wide-angle lens, suitable for landscape as well as capturing close environments. By setting a high ISO value in combination with aperture setting f2.5, it is possible to shoot indoors as long as there is not too much movement in the scene. The lens is fully automatic and is extremely compact and lightweight. First, I will have a look at the physical aspects of the lens, then the specified optics and functionality, before moving on to various aspects of image quality. Finally, I will present my conclusions about the lens, with some comments about how to use it and what kind of photography it's good for. Let's start with the physical characteristics of the lens. I measured the weight to be about 54 grams without lens caps, which is extremely light. I found the length to be about 25mm, including about 5mm bayonet which goes into the camera body when attached. The filter thread has 46mm diameter, which is very common, and the outer diameter is about 50mm. This is kind of an ultra-compact lens. These kind of lenses are often referred to as pancake lenses. As the case with many other native Micro Four Thirds lenses, the lens hood has to be purchased separately. In my opinion, I think it should always be included to make it a complete package. Usually the original lens hoods are very expensive, but there are much cheaper alternatives available from third-party vendors, usually on eBay or Amazon. I bought a light metal lens hood for this lens at a low price. This lens is for the most part made of plastic, which makes it really light, but it also makes it feel less of a high-end lens. There is a plastic focusing ring without any scale or stop, which is not enjoyable to use. The focus ring has no stops, it's just direction, so it's not possible to find the near focus or infinity by looking at the focus ring. Most people probably use the autofocus, then this is not an issue. There is no aperture ring, which I think is perfectly okay. If the aperture is set manually, it's better to do it from the camera body instead of using an aperture ring. That makes it easier to see the aperture setting in the finder, especially in darkness. And it is also good to be able to do it while aiming the camera. The lens is not weather sealed. If you intend to use it outdoors in bad weather, then that needs to be considered. The focal length is 14mm as previously mentioned, which corresponds to a 28mm lens for a full-frame camera, which makes it a wide-angle lens. It has an aperture setting between f2.5 to f22. The aperture has 7 circular diaphragm blades. The closest focus is 0.18 meters, which is not macro distance at this focal length. The lens has support for autofocus and aperture control from the camera, which makes it easy to use for quick shots. There is no image stabilization in the lens. The lens communicates the EXIF data to the camera. In other words, the focal length and aperture setting for each shot is saved to the image file. I have taken photos of a test pattern using 3 apertures to check if there's any vignetting or distortion in the images. The resulting images show a slight barrel distortion, which can barely be seen in the test pattern. The lens also has a certain amount of vignetting, especially at the largest aperture f2.5. You can stop the video for each setting and have a closer look at the images of the test pattern. In a typical image, the distortion will not be visible, and the vignetting can easily be compensated for in a post-processing software. When looking at the center and edges of the test images, it's possible to see the sharpness for the different aperture settings. Overall, I find this lens to be sharp, even for the largest aperture, where there may be a slight fall off at the edge, but very little. My impression is that the sharpness is one of the strengths of this lens. I took a photo of dark objects against a bright background and found no visible chromatic aberration. That photo was shot with the largest aperture, f2.5. Chromatic aberration is most common for large apertures. I show some sample images to give an idea about the color rendering. My impression of the color rendering is that it's neutral. Overall, the images are very sharp with good quality, although there may be a hint of vignetting visible when using the largest aperture. I shot a short video against a bright light source to see how much flare is visible in the image. As can be seen in that clip, there is a certain amount of flare. One should keep in mind that this was shot first straight at the light source, where a clear flare pattern becomes visible. When shooting the video just under the light source, there is a bit of flare looking more like light rays. If the lens hood is used, the situation can of course be improved a bit. I recommend using lens hood and avoid aiming at intense light sources whenever possible. For the largest aperture, f2.5, it is actually a bit hard to blur out the background, even when moving as close as possible to the object, while having a background much further away. It is possible, but not very effective. I guess the compact design didn't allow larger apertures than f2.5. The typical use for this kind of lens is landscape photography, since wide angle can capture much of the environment. It's good for photos of group at close distance, for instance at a table indoors, which can be used for social media posts, etc. It's good for environment photography, street photo from close distance. It captures lots of the surroundings. Architectural photography is possible, for instance to capture wide angle indoors. Low light photography or indoor photography for static or scenes with little motion. Here are my conclusions about the lens. Let's summarize the negative and the positive with this lens. First, the negative. There's no lens hood included. It has a plastic feel with a simple focus ring. No image stabilization. It is not weather sealed. There is a bit of vignetting and flare. The use of it is overlapping the use of a typical smartphone, which has about the same focal length. The positive. This is a very compact, lightweight lens which fits into the shirt pocket. It is fairly bright with low light capability, very sharp, low distortion, very little chromatic aberration, support for autofocus and aperture control. This lens can be used for landscapes, group photos for social media, or architectural indoor photos. It can also be used for action photography since it's fully automatic. In my opinion, this is a very good lens considering it's lightweight and compact. It has some optical imperfections, but it does a good job when it comes to important things such as sharpness and chromatic aberration. The focal length is very useful and the optics is relatively bright at f2.5. Now in year 2020 the price is about $200 or 200 euros, which I think is neither cheap or expensive considering the performance of the lens. But what needs to be taken into consideration is the huge overlap in usage in relation to the smartphone cameras. Although this is a lens on a camera, which can do much more than a smartphone camera, the question is how many % of the photos need the extra control you get from a camera. After all, most people already have a more compact camera in their pocket, which is on the smartphone, which is more or less the same focal length, and it's fully automatic with built-in post-processing and internet connection. So the price you pay for this kind of lens is for the situations that the smartphone camera cannot handle. What you pay for depends on what kind of user you are. If you use an interchangeable lens camera with fully automatic program setting most of the time, then you may already have what you need. If you often use very fast or very slow shutter speed settings or large aperture setting for low light or object isolation, then you pay more or less for those extra functions. There are some lenses available at around this focal length with similar or better performance. There are some good alternatives. First, we have the Olympus 12mm F2.5, which is a very good lens, but it is almost twice as expensive as this lens. It has larger aperture and it's also much heavier than this lens. Another alternative is the Samyang 12mm F2.5. That lens has about the same price as this lens, but it is a manual lens and it's much bigger and heavier. At the same time, it's brighter at f2.0. So finally, is this lens good value for the money? My conclusion is, it depends. It is a good and useful lens, but the usage of this lens overlaps the smartphone camera you may already have. If you mostly shoot typical wide-angle shots daytime with medium shutter speeds, then consider using the smartphone camera instead and save the money for a lens with a larger aperture or other lenses with longer or shorter focal length. If you use that extra control of settings, then you should look for a bargain price, possibly on the second-hand market, where I think you can find this lens for less than half the price of a new lens. I think this lens is an interesting case. If smartphone cameras didn't exist, I would say this is a useful camera lens despite some compromises in optical performance. I may do a video to compare this lens with a typical mobile device camera in a video soon. I am curious to know how much difference there is for a typical wide-angle photo, shot first with the lens and then with the smartphone camera. I hope this was useful information for you. If you find this video interesting, please like and subscribe. Have a nice day.